The citizens of Egypt are suffering, and it's all because of the IMF. For almost a decade, the IMF has been the director of the Egyptian economy, dictating which economic policies to be implemented by the government. However, in all these times, the Egyptian economy has only gone from bad to worse. And right now, the situation has become even more terrible, as citizens are struggling to afford their basic needs. However, the president of Egypt recently announced that with the current economic situation, Egypt will have to ditch the IMF and its policies and begin to look inwards. But what are these IMF policies and how have they destroyed Egypt's economy? Let's find out. In March 2024, Egypt signed an $8 billion financial support package with the International Monetary Fund. But this package required that it would have to reduce subsidies on fuel, electricity, and other commodities, and also allow its currency to float freely. What this simply means is that the Egypt government would have to stop paying a particular amount on these commodities that allowed citizens to easily afford them, leading to an increase in the price of these commodities. Now, in exchange, the IMF package would unlock billions of dollars in loans from the World Bank and the European Union, which, don't forget, would put Egypt in more debt. The Egyptian government did as the IMF suggested, and as you can imagine, the price of basic commodities went up drastically. In June, for instance, it raised the price of bread, which used to be subsidized by 300%. Just last week, Egypt raised the price on a wide range of fuel products for the third time this year, with diesel and gasoline prices increasing by between 11% to 17%. And guess what? According to Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli, the price of fuel would continue to increase till the end of 2025, meaning that its citizens would continue to suffer. As the cost of living is increasing in Egypt, so is the poverty rate, which has increased to almost 30%. The Egyptian pound has halved against the dollar, and the inflation rate has increased to almost 33%. But it's not just the citizens that have been affected. The government revenue has also been affected. According to President Sisi, Egypt has lost about 6 to 7 billion in revenue in the last 7 to 10 months. And he added that it might continue to lose more revenue for at least another year. Overall, the situation in Egypt is really bad, and the citizens have raised an uproar about it, saying that the government is not doing anything to fix the situation. But all that is happening right now is because of years of austerity policies implemented by the government on the suggestion of the IMF. This is why the president of Egypt announced that the country might have to abandon the IMF policies and look for another alternative. Speaking at a conference, President Sisi stated that, "As for the program we're engaged in now, and this is a message we're sending to ourselves and to concerned international institutions, the Fund and the World Bank and all the institutions, we are doing this under extremely difficult regional and global circumstances." He further added that, "The program we have agreed upon with the Fund, and that is an important matter that I am telling the government and myself, if this challenge will hurt public opinion, that people cannot bear it, we must reevaluate our situation." This will be the topic of discussion between Egypt and the IMF and World Bank during the IMF and World Bank annual meetings, which will be held this week. Before we proceed, this is a reminder to like, comment, and subscribe so that you can get more videos like this. Now the question is, why is Egypt allowing the IMF and World Bank to make decisions regarding its economy? Well, you see, Egypt, like every other African country, needs funds to run its economy. And the World Bank and IMF are global financial institutions that were created to help countries in times of financial need. The World Bank was initially tasked with the responsibility of providing loans to rebuild post-war Europe, thereby supporting the continent's long-term development. However, today its mission has expanded to reducing extreme poverty around the world by providing loans. The IMF, on the other hand, was created to oversee the stability of the world's monetary system. However, these institutions were created by the West, meaning that every decision and policy they make and advocate is based on the principles and ideals of the West. This is why, when the IMF and World Bank lend out loans to countries, especially from Africa, they usually add conditions in exchange for the loans. One such condition is that the country will have to practice Western ideologies such as democracy and freedom of expression, such as LGBTQ rights. So, if a country doesn't support LGBTQ in its constitution, it might have to do so if it wants to collect a loan from the World Bank. This is why the World Bank and IMF blocked Uganda's access to loans last year, after it enforced an anti-gay law. But aside from this, there is another condition that the World Bank and IMF always attach to their loans. And, based on research, we can boldly say that this condition is what has stunted the economic growth of the African continent and is also what has destroyed the Egyptian economy. This condition is based on neoliberal principles. You see, in exchange for loans from the IMF and World Bank, these institutions insist that African countries must implement their neoliberal policies in their economies. By neoliberal policies, we mean the government is required to cut down on government spending and practice privatization, austerity, and forced market liberalization. These countries are also required to devalue their currencies, leaving them to float on their own. However, the result of these policies has been disastrous for African economies. You see, the IMF and World Bank started advocating for these neoliberal policies in African countries as the solution to their problem after the independence period. Following independence, most African countries were vulnerable and shaky, and so their governments decided to turn to the World Bank and IMF for help. These institutions agreed to grant African countries loans, but in exchange, they will have to implement the neoliberal policies. At the time, this policy was known as the Structural Adjustment Program. Believing that it would improve their economies, the governments agreed to implement the policies. But if you do in-depth research, you will discover that those policies are the foundation of the problems faced by African economies today. Although most African countries dropped the policies, they are still suffering the effects of the policies today. This is because the policies opened the doors for Western MNCs to exploit and profit from Africa, all in the name of foreign investment. These policies also led to a decrease in income, an increase in poverty, and decades of recession and stagnation. However, despite this, the World Bank and IMF still continue to attach these policies as a condition for loans. It's as if they believe that the more African countries implement the policies, the better their economies will get. But isn't it insanity to keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result? Or maybe these institutions do not want to see African economies get better. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this is the case because the IMF and World Bank are Western-led institutions, and it's a known fact that the West does not want the progress of Africa. The World Bank and IMF were created to eradicate poverty in developing countries. However, these institutions have single-handedly created more poverty-stricken countries than any other institutions. It is for this reason that some experts have called the World Bank and IMF the biggest scam of the century. The situation in Egypt is exactly what most African countries are facing today. Since 2017, the IMF has been heavily involved in the economic affairs of Egypt. And, since then, Egypt has become the second biggest client of the IMF in the world. For some reason, the IMF has allowed Egypt to borrow in extraordinary decisions beyond the amount available to it. In fact, it has borrowed $20 billion in 3 loans, in addition to a new loan of $8 billion over the next 3 years. The IMF has also become the godfather of Egypt's external borrowing policy, encouraging lenders in international capital markets to invest in its sovereign debt. And as we said, the IMF has become one of the major architects of Egypt's economic policy over the past 7 years. Yet, the economic situation has not gotten any better. Instead, it has become progressively worse. However, according to the IMF, its first prescription in Egypt, the Extended Credit Financing Program 2017 to 2019, succeeded in strengthening Egypt's resilience. And the economic problems that followed this program were simply the result of external shocks, such as COVID-19, the Russian war in Ukraine, global inflation, rising global interest rates, and finally the Israeli war on the Gaza Strip. But if that were true, why did these external shocks affect Egypt and its citizens more than most countries with similar income levels? Why did Egypt's inflation index explode more than others? Why has the value of the local currency deteriorated? Why has the food security index deteriorated? Why have education and health reforms not led to greater equality of opportunity? The data, however, tells the truth. You see, after the full implementation of the measures demanded by the IMF in 2017, poverty and hunger rates rose to all-time high levels, reaching respectively 32.5% and 6.2% in 2018. Between 2020 and 2022, 28.5% of the population in Egypt experienced severe to moderate food insecurity, and the undernourishment rate was the highest in that period. In addition, between 2016 and 2023, external debt more than doubled, rising from $55.8 billion to $164.5 billion, and its maturity structure deteriorated. Repayments due abroad within a year in September 2023 amounted to $51 billion, equivalent to about 1.5 times international reserves at the end of 2023. Furthermore, in the first quarter of 2023, the Egyptian pound was already the 6th worst performing currency against the dollar. All this simply reveals that it was the policies of the IMF and World Bank that pushed Egypt's economy to this state, like it did with other African economies. So, what does this tell us? It's simple. African countries should ditch the World Bank and IMF and look for other alternatives to get funds. These institutions do not obviously mean well for African countries, so the best thing to do is to ditch them. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.